I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network, and this is a breaking news alert. Donald Trump just sent a deranged 14-page ranting and raving, completely bizarre screed to the January 6th committee talking about Antifa and hacks and thugs and hoax this, hoax that, fake news. The opening line of his letter to the January 6th committee submitted on Friday states, "The presidential election of 2020 was rigged and stolen," with an exclamation point in all caps. And then it gets even more bizarre and deranged from there. This letter by Donald Trump was submitted directly with his signature to the January 6th committee, addressed to the Honorable Benny G. Thompson, the chairperson of the January 6th committee. And it follows the January 6th committee's hearing on Thursday, the incredibly compelling hearing where the January 6th committee brought new evidence it recently obtained from the Secret Service, new footage of what was transpiring on January 6th with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in the absence of Donald Trump taking any action. In fact, in Donald Trump being in furtherance of supporting the insurrectionists trying to kill politicians, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and others had to actually assume leadership roles to call up the National Guard and to call governors to try to take action. And this January 6th committee hearing tied together all of the elements demonstrating clearly and convincingly and beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump had an obvious intent to not just not act, but to affirmatively harm, kill politicians and undermine, destroy, and try to overthrow our democracy. That January 6th committee hearing concluded with a vote, a 9-0 vote by all members of the committee to subpoena Trump. A subpoena will be sent out to Trump. Trump completely ignores in this letter the fact that he was subpoenaed. He does not address the fact that he was subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, but nonetheless, he responds with this 14-page, literally looks like a lunatic. I mean, it is a lunatic who wrote the letter, but this letter is one of the most insane letters ever written to the Honorable Benny G. Thompson. And the letter says, I'm just going to read some of it for you because if I read all of it, we'll all get a headache, but we'll post a link of it if you wanted to read it. "The same group of radical left Democrats who utilized their majority position in Congress to create Russia, 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 impeachment hoax number 1, impeachment hoax 2, $48 million Mueller report, which ended in no collusion, Ukraine, 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 the atrocious and illegal spying on my campaign, and so much more, are the people who created the committee of highly partisan political hacks and thugs whose sole function is to destroy the lives of many hardworking American patriots, whose records in life have been unblemished until this point of attempted ruination. The double standard of the unselects between what has taken place on the right, all in caps, and what has taken place in the radical left, lawless groups, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and others, is startling and will never be acceptable, even to those who will be writing the history of what you have done to America." That's like one sentence that he wrote. And the letter even gets more deranged than there. He goes, "This memo is being written to express our anger, disappointment, and complaint that with all the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on what many consider to be a charade and witch hunt, and despite strong and powerful requests," strong and bad, this guy is such an idiot, "you have not spent even a short moment examining massive election fraud that took place during the 2020 presidential election." And then it proceeds to have it goes on and on and on, but proceeds to have an appendix which shows what he claims to be the crowd size on January 6th. And then the appendix literally resurfaces all of the debunked conspiracy theories in each state that have been absolutely rejected. And not just rejected, where federal courts over 70 times ruled against Trump, and not only just ruled against Trump, but that the lawsuits in many of them were just so frivolous that the lawyers have either lost their legal license, have been sanctioned severely, or are facing other investigatory efforts by their local bars, their state bars, for engaging and filing such frivolous lawsuits before these federal courts. You've had all of these like fraudits that have taken place with these extremist MAGA groups that have tried to even do audits that have been sponsored by radical Republican legislatures. They haven't supported these claims. All of these are conspiracy theories that have been debunked. They've been debunked by Bill Barr. They've been debunked by Trump's Justice Department. They've been debunked by everyone other than the people like Sidney Powell and the fascist pillow guy and Donald Trump and Kash Patel and Roger Stone and people who are trying to overthrow our democracy with their lies. But that's what the appendix has here. Each of the states and each of the lies that have been, again, all debunked in the states, which I'm not going to in any way just repeat all of the lies there. But some important things to think about, though, with this letter, because this letter is an incredibly incriminating document for Donald Trump. And let's just think about what the January 6th committee's genius already was in issuing that subpoena to Donald Trump. Because while Trump doesn't respond directly to the subpoena here, and maybe he'll obstruct the subpoena. I'm sure he will try to obstruct and not testify before them, or if he does, he'll have to plead the fifth, but more on that in a second. Just think about what that act of voting on the subpoena did. The fact that Trump wrote this document right here is like Exhibit A of Trump's criminal intent. It shows that not only he supported the election disinformation and supported the big lie and supported the conduct of insurrectionists who he refers to as patriots here in this letter. It also shows that he's engaged in ongoing conduct to obstruct and to continue to spread the lie. And so the fact that you have a document like this here, again, is evidence of intent. And frankly, it could also be construed as another form of obstruction here of Donald Trump attacking the Department of Justice and, again, trying to inspire more violent acts against the Department of Justice, against the January 6th committee. But as you go into it, it shows Trump's direct involvement, direct knowledge with respect to each of the lies being told, and by extension, the fake elector scheme that the MAGA Republicans tried to implement. We learned from the recent January 6th committee that Donald Trump and John Eastman directly called Ronna McDaniel and tried to do a run-through of the fake elector schemes. They did like a run-through of the coup, and Trump was on that. But we see over here Trump being directly and intimately involved and having knowledge of all of the lies that he spread, the big lie that he spread, and that he's been calling the shots regarding all of this. Because one of the things, obviously we knew he was calling the shots, but he's been trying to hide behind people like John Eastman and Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Roger Stone and Steve Bannon, and people who have either pled the fifth or people who have engaged in contempt of Congress who were directly linked to Trump. But here we have a letter directly from Trump to the chairperson of the January 6th committee, Benny Thompson, sprouting all of these election lies, spreading the big lie, attacking the January 6th committee, attacking the FBI, attacking the Department of Justice, attacking people who are supporting our democracy, and spreading all of the lies, all of the defamatory statements that were rejected by federal court after federal court. One of the other things with this letter is it's demonstrative of the fact that Donald Trump will not be able to assert the executive privilege. I mean, it seems obvious. I mean, we've talked before about how this case called Nixon versus GSA from the 1970s and other precedent to that effect basically states that the executive privilege lies with the executive branch, and past presidential administrations can't assert executive privilege. But there is a potential, based on the case law out there, there is a potential that when it comes to an inter-branch dispute, when it comes to a dispute of a co-equal branch of government, when the dispute is between Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and the executive branch, a prior president may be able to assert executive privilege in an inter-branch dispute if no exceptions to executive privilege apply. Where you can't assert executive privilege under that Nixon versus GSA line of cases, though, is to stop the current executive branch from having its own records back, to assert it essentially as a shield against the actual current executive branch. The current executive branch holds it. So that's why in the Judge Eileen Cannon matter, it's beyond dispute that a prior president can't claim executive privilege to stop the current executive branch from its own criminal investigation and utilizing its own executive branch documents. But here, in response to the subpoena that was issued on Thursday by the January 6th committee, one could argue, well, would Donald Trump try to assert executive privilege against that? Would he try to assert attorney-client privilege against that? And one of the things I previously have discussed in other videos here on the MeidasTouch network is that because Donald Trump has said a lot of these things publicly in his rallies, through his social media company, executive privilege is supposed to protect confidential, deliberative communications by the president with staff or with executive branch members to try to avoid that confidential information from getting out in the public, because there's a public policy that we don't want to chill the unfettered communications of presidents, right? Because we didn't believe, and our founders didn't believe, and our public policy didn't believe that you would have presidents who would actually lead insurrections and try to overthrow democracy. So we want to support their confidential, deliberative communications. But there are exceptions to the executive privilege. You could waive it, like if you talk about it publicly. There's no longer a confidential communication if you're speaking about it publicly. Another exception is if you're engaged in a crime. Same thing with attorney-client privilege. It can be waived if you, as the privilege holder, the client is the one who holds the privilege, or the executive is the one who holds the privilege. If you start speaking about it publicly, if you start speaking about the advice you're getting from your attorney publicly, the law says there is no confidential attorney-client privilege. Or if you speak about the executive privilege stuff publicly, there is no confidential executive privilege anymore because you're talking about it publicly. Or if you're engaged in criminal conduct, like if you're using your attorney to commit a crime, or you're speaking about how to commit crimes with your attorney, that's called the crime fraud exception. And same thing with the executive privilege. You can't use that to try to shroud in secrecy your commission of criminal conduct. And so what you may recall, for example, John Eastman tried to claim that his communications with Donald Trump were attorney-client privilege documents and attorney-client privilege communications. When the January 6th committee tried to subpoena John Eastman's records, John Eastman filed a lawsuit to block the January 6th committee, which was filed in the Central District Southern Division in California before federal Judge David Carter. And Judge David Carter made a ruling that what Eastman and Trump were engaged in was not just normal attorney-client communications, but rather a coup coup in search of a legal theory, and federal judge David Carter found that it was more likely than not that Trump and Eastman, his lawyer, were engaged in a criminal conspiracy to overthrow our government, and Judge David Carter ordered that those emails, or most of the emails, be turned over to the January 6th committee. So that same kind of logic of crime fraud exception and public disclosure of a potential privilege, I believe, would be used to vitiate any potential executive privilege claim. So if Trump was planning on claiming his role relating to the 2020 election and trying to overthrow the free and fair election in 2020, if he's trying to say, you can't ask me questions about that, I'm asserting attorney-client privilege. I always said before, what the January 6th committee is going to argue, or even what the Department of Justice could argue in their criminal investigation, is, look, we're just asking you questions about things you talked about on your social media company. We're asking about things you said on your interview. But undoubtedly, if Trump's going to now claim, in response to the January 6th committee subpoena, executive privilege, you can't ask me these questions, what's the January 6th committee going to do? They're going to say, all we want to ask you about is what you said in the letter that you submitted to us. You can't claim executive privilege over what you just submitted to us in your letter. And also, you wrote this letter October 13, 2022. We want to ask you questions about the letter that you just wrote after you were the president. So even if you were the president, we could ask you those questions, but you wrote this letter after as well. So clearly the executive privilege can apply, and you wrote it publicly right now. So there's clearly now a public disclosure of it, which would vitiate any claims of confidentiality. And ultimately, if Trump doesn't appear, or his objections are going to be invalid, and he's compelled to show up, and he does not show up, then the January 6th committee is going to seek a criminal referral from the Department of Justice. And I've analyzed in other videos what I think the Department of Justice could do, or what their overall strategy would do there. But that's how it would play out. And for the Department of Justice, they now have this incredibly incriminating document where Trump's showing all knowledge, all intent about the big lie. That's all in this. His attacks and his relentless attacks demonstrate also his engaging in obstruction-like conduct here. And so the Department of Justice now has great evidence, Exhibit A, thanks to Donald Trump. But this letter is this is some really deranged stuff. And as we reflect on the midterms, just in addition to it being incriminating for Donald Trump, because this letter is incredibly incriminating, it waives any of the privileges that he may have to try to claim confidentiality. But at its most basic level, this is the cult leader who the Republican Party worships. This is who they are afraid to challenge. This is who not only they're not afraid to challenge, this is who they idolize, conduct like this. If this was sent in any setting, say it's not a president, just say it's a coworker that you know, or a family member, or a colleague, or a neighbor, or somebody sent you a letter like this, you would call the police. You'd call the FBI. You would maybe get a restraining order. You would say, this is completely alarming, distressing, dangerous conduct. I need to be protected from this person who sent me this letter. This is like a real sick and disturbed and dangerous individual. And that's what this is. This letter, no Republican will call this out. No Republican will condemn this. No, everyone will be, this is whatever. He's just saying what he's saying. This is some deranged and dangerous stuff at its most basic level. The language, the run-on sentences, the threats, the lies, the disinformation, the conflagration of all of that is just so utterly disturbing in this 14-page bizarre letter. Anyway, I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit the subscribe button. It's free. We're on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to you. Make sure you hit the subscribe button right now. Also, if you want to support independent media like this, I know you do. Here's what you can do. Head to patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. There's a bunch of different exclusive membership packages there. You could become an honorary producer of the MeidasTouch podcast, get postcards from me and my brother. We have exclusive behind-the-scenes footage, behind-the-scenes podcast, exclusive podcasts, and more. And it just helps grow this network. Wherever you are in the world, you can join. Patreon.com/MeidasTouch, Patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Until next time, I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network.
At MeidasTouch, we are unapologetically pro-democracy, and we demand justice and accountability. That's why we're spreading our message to Convict 45. That's right, gear up right now with your Convict 45 tees and pins at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.